emperor's sayings. During the early part of the year 1819, Madame Bertrand had sent her, by her aunt, Lady Jerningham, a young woman, to be the governess of the Grand Marshal's children. Several years had passed since we had reached Longwood, and how many more might we spend there? In this uncertainty for the future, and living, so to speak, in a sort of continual seclusion, having no other distraction but work, which demanded a great deal of assiduity, and which was broken only by a few minutes for a walk. I thought I ought to marry in order to lead the life of a husband and father. I saw a great deal of the young woman, and I learned to know her and appreciate her good qualities, which everybody praised. She had been very well brought up. After some months of attentions, I decided to carry out my plan, being certain that I was not displeasing to Miss Hall. This was the young woman's name. Novaraz had been married for a few months, and the priests had arrived not long before. Having made my declaration, I continued to pay court to her, whom my heart had chosen, while awaiting a favorable moment to speak to the emperor about it. I hesitated, fearing a refusal. Finally, one day, I made up my mind, and I seized my opportunity. He was in a good humor, and passed into his salon, where I followed him. I told him that I intended to get married, and that I wished to have his assent, or, to speak more accurately, his consent. I do not recollect what objections he made or what I replied. In short, I obtained his approval. As soon as I had a moment's liberty, I went to see Madame Bertrand, to whom I told my good news, and I hastened to tell it to my intended, who received it with great pleasure. I thought that I needed the ceremony of the English church, although my fiancée was Catholic, but she was English, and we were in a Protestant country. It was a civil marriage for me. Wishing to avoid all ceremony at Longwood, I arranged with Abbé Bonavita to have the marriage take place in his apartments, which presented no difficulty. The next day, or the day after, my wife and I went on horseback to Plantation House, where there was a Protestant chapel. Piero Novaraz and his wife, and perhaps someone else, accompanied us. When we got to the chapel, we found the clergyman there, Mr. Vernon, who proceeded at once with the customary service. With this ceremony, which was very simple, was finished, we got on horses again and went to ride about on different estates to use up the time which we had to ourselves. When we had finished our ride, we went back to Longwood, where we arrived in time for the emperor's dinner. Ours was a sort of little wedding feast. There were more dishes on the table than usual. During the evening, Madame Bertrand sent my wife a box filled with different articles of dress. The next day I resumed my service with the emperor, and my wife went on with hers at the countess's. Before my marriage, I had been lodged like the rest in one of the attics which were above the emperor's rooms. The place was good enough for one person, but it was much too small for two. When I was staying with my wife, the emperor said to Monsieur de Montsalon, it would be well to enlarge Elie's lodging so that he could come back there. Give him Cipriani's room, he went on. Have it arranged for him. It would not be human to leave him in such a hole. Monsieur de Montsalon had a window made which had a view on the emperor's garden, and had a rafter cut away so as to reach it. Partitions covered with paper transformed a wretched garret into a very pretty and most agreeable apartment. We had a view of part of the emperor's garden, the lawn, the wood of Longwood, the black rocks, and the sea on the horizon. One day, as he was walking in his gardens, the emperor, seeing some cows pasturing in one of the spots which he had surrounded by little walls of turf, sent to me to ask for his guns to drive them away. He was very angry because these animals had been permitted to get into his space which was reserved for him, and where they spoiled everything. I went to find him and tell him that I was not bringing his guns because, having just cleaned them thoroughly, I had not put them together again. He got angry, and when I replied to him hurriedly, having made use of the pronoun you instead of the customary expression, Your Majesty, he gave me a kick to punish me for my lack of respect or for my impertinence, apostrophizing me with the sharpest and most humiliating expressions which could be suggested by great anger. I was very far from having deserved such treatment, for I had had no idea of offending him. I was much too attached and too devoted to him for that. It was a momentary forgetfulness of proprieties at most. I went out from his presence with sadness in my soul. I told Novaraz to take care of his arms. The emperor's ill humor was never durable. The first time that I had to take the night service, We were both a little embarrassed, each one a little reserved, but after the first few minutes the emperor resumed his usual attitude towards me, which was one of kindliness, and I forgot the unhappiness which had been caused by the cake and the abusive words which had sounded in my ears. A short time was enough to cause all trace of the unfortunate scene which had so deeply affected me to disappear. I was directed to take charge of the arms again. One evening, when I was on duty, I was lying on the sofa in our antechamber with my wife sitting near me. We had left the table an hour before. Marchand and the other members of the household were still in the dining room. The emperor was in his room. At the moment when I least expected it, I saw him appear in his shirt, coming out of the door of his dining room. Ill humor showed in his face. He passed before me, going toward his bathroom, saying that he was very badly served. I did not know what he meant. The moment I saw him, I had risen and was watching him go. At first, he did not seem to see me, but afterwards, turning his eyes in my direction, he said to me, "You go up to your room to see your wife and leave me alone." I replied, begging his pardon, that I had not gone away and that I was there on the sofa, and I added with a somewhat serious air, "Sire, when I am on duty, I never absent myself." But he continued to repeat that he was badly served, as though I had not said anything. Before going back to his room through the bathroom, he ordered me to call Marchand. The latter came at once and had to catch the tail end of the quarrel. The cause of the emperor's irritation was that he had pulled the rope of his bell, and the bell had not rung because something was out of order in the mechanism. When the weather was fine, the emperor was accustomed to go and walk in his garden immediately after he rose and before and after his dinner. If he saw the Grand Marshal's children, he would call them. The children who were accustomed to receive something from him would remain at a little distance, and as soon as they heard him call, they quickly covered the distance which separated them from him. It amused him to question them as to what they were doing and what they were going to do. "Do you know your lessons well?" he would say to one, and to another, "Say your multiplication table to me." If he was pleased with their replies, he would send for bonbons and give them some. He would make them breakfast with him once in a while. He was pleased when he got a chance to play tricks on them, and their little quarrels amused him. He was very fond of seeing them about him. He was charmed by their innocence and by the frankness with which they expressed their thoughts and desires. "There's no beating about the bush with them," he would say. "They say naturally whatever comes into their heads. If they are greedy, they ask without hesitation. The little belly always rules. What a happy age is childhood," he would go on. "It's the golden age of a man's life. His misfortunes would have been greatly softened. He would have borne them with still more resignation if he had had his son with him. The consolation had been refused him. Consequently, he would often say, 'How much happier is a cobbler than I am. He at least has his wife and children with him.' In spite of the trials which he had to suffer in so many ways, the memory of his power was always very agreeable dream to him. 'I placed all my glory,' he said, 'in making the French the first people of the universe. All my desire, all my ambition was that they should surpass the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans, as much in arms as in the sciences and arts. France was already the most beautiful, the most fertile country. Manners had there arrived at a degree of civilization unknown till then. In a word, it was already as worthy to command the world as was ancient Rome. I should have accomplished my end if Marplat's conspirators, men of party, immoral men, had not raised up obstacle after obstacle and stopped me in my march. I know very well that such a project was gigantic, but what can one not do with Frenchmen? It was no small accomplishment to have succeeded in governing the principal part of Europe and to have subjected it to a unity of laws. Nations directed by a just, wise, enlightened government would, in time, have drawn in other nations, and all would have made one family. When once everything had been settled, I should have established a government in which the people would have nothing to dread from arbitrary authority. Every man would have been a man and simply subject to the common law. There would be nothing privileged but merit. But to make such a project succeed, one would have to be fortunate and to have 20 years ahead of him. Religion was a slight obstacle to my system, but there was a way in which it could be used. That was to close my eyes and favor all sects which presented themselves and had healthy and true morals as a base. Men divided in this way as respects all matters of conscience would have been only the more submissive to law. That being so, one would have had the advantage of being able to diminish the abuses and reach the perfectibility possible to men. Oh, just and wise toleration in religion is a benefit to governments. A religion is only a law which directs the conscience, as long as it undertakes to follow the impulse of nature in all that is good and social, when it purifies morals and rejects everything which can injure the propagation of the human race order liberty. It ought to be adopted, protected, and supported. Have we not seen during the centuries which preceded us how dangerous it was to be intolerant, exclusive? God protect us from having to endure such a calamity, which is the destruction of the nations. Let us be wiser than our ancestors. Let us look only for the public welfare and happiness. It is too much, undoubtedly, to have involved questions in public affairs. The simpler things are, the less trouble they give us. Alas, yesterday we came into this world, today we possess it, and tomorrow we disappear under its surface. Let us try, then, to be happy in this world, where we stay only a few minutes.